You're wading through an infinite graveyard of mud. Every step is a struggle against suction that wants to pull you down into hell. You haven't slept in 96 hours because there's literally no dry land anywhere. If you stop moving, you sink. If you fall, the mud swallows you whole and you drown standing up. Around you, men are dying in the most pathetic way possible, too exhausted to even lift their heads above the filthy water. And leading this march of the damned through this nightmare is a man riding the last surviving elephant. He's gripping the reins with hands shaking from fever. His right eye is swollen completely shut, leaking infection, throbbing with pain so intense it would incapacitate any normal soldier. But he doesn't stop. He doesn't scream. He doesn't even slow down. He just keeps pushing forward into the hell ahead. This is the brutal reality of 217 BC, and the man who's destroying his own body to destroy Rome. His name is Hannibal Barca. And what you're about to hear will make every obstacle you've ever faced look like absolutely nothing. Think about the worst physical pain you've ever experienced. A broken bone, a bad infection. Now imagine choosing to make it worse. Imagine deliberately letting your eye rot out of your skull, because stopping to treat it would cost you strategic advantage. That's not bravery. That's something beyond human. But here's what nobody tells you about Hannibal Barca. This moment in the swamp isn't even close to the worst thing he endured. This is just Tuesday for him. The real question is, what creates a human being capable of this level of suffering? What turns a 9-year-old boy into a monster who can watch his own eye die without flinching? Before we dive into this relentless story of survival and revenge that will redefine what you think human beings are capable of, make sure you hit that subscribe button for Maproom Battles, because this story gets so much darker and more incredible than you can possibly imagine. The crossing of the Arno marshes wasn't a military march. It was a slow-motion disaster that most history books conveniently gloss over. Everyone talks about the Alps because mountains make for dramatic paintings. But the Alps were just cold and dangerous. The marshes were a special kind of hell, designed specifically to break the human spirit. For 4 days and 3 nights straight, Hannibal's army didn't touch dry ground even once. They didn't make camp. They didn't cook food. They didn't rest. They just walked through liquid filth. And if you've ever tried walking through mud, you know how exhausting it is after just a few minutes. Now imagine 4 days of it without stopping. The logistics of this nightmare are almost incomprehensible. The soldiers at the front of the column churned the ground into a deep slurry as they passed. By the time the rear guard arrived at the same spot hours later, they were essentially walking through liquid sewage, mixed with the corpses of pack animals that had already drowned. The path kept getting worse as more men and animals passed through. When exhaustion finally hit, and it hit everyone because you can't fight biology, men didn't lie down on solid ground to sleep. There was no solid ground. Instead, they climbed onto the bloated, rotting carcasses of dead pack animals just to keep their heads out of the water for a few precious minutes of unconsciousness. They used dead horses and mules as rafts. Picture that. Picture being so desperate for sleep that you curl up on a decomposing animal floating in sewage. This is the level of absolute desperation that Hannibal demanded from his men. And he didn't demand it from a position of comfort. He paid the price himself in the most brutal way possible, riding atop Surus, his last surviving war elephant. Hannibal was technically elevated above the worst of the mud, but he couldn't escape the infection that was spreading through the camp like wildfire. The swamp bacteria settled into his right eye, Maybe it entered through a small scratch. Maybe it was just the constant exposure to filth. Either way, the inflammation was catastrophic and fast. He had no doctors worth mentioning. He had no clean bandages. He had no antibiotics because they wouldn't be invented for another 2,000 years. And he had absolutely no time to stop and treat the infection properly. The Roman army was somewhere ahead, and every hour he delayed gave them time to prepare. So Hannibal made a choice that most human beings couldn't even comprehend. He simply let the eye die. He felt it going blind, felt the pain spreading through the socket, and just accepted it. He sacrificed half his vision, permanently, to keep the army moving forward. Think about that decision. He looked at the tactical situation and calculated that his eyesight was worth less than the speed advantage. Why? Why drive an entire army through a route that's killing them faster than the enemy possibly could? Because Hannibal understood something about warfare that most generals never grasp. Speed is the most deadly weapon that exists. The Roman consul Flaminius was waiting on the main road with his legions, guarding the easy path, absolutely confident that no army could survive the marshes. He'd done the math. It was impossible. He was catastrophically wrong. Hannibal didn't just flank the Romans. He materialized behind them like a ghost appearing out of thin air. When his army finally stumbled onto dry land in Etruria, they were caked in dried mud, half-starved, disease-ridden, and their commander was literally half-blind. But they had achieved the impossible. They had bypassed every single fortification Rome had spent decades building. The shock wasn't just tactical. It was psychological warfare at its most brutal. Hannibal had proven something terrifying to the Romans. He would endure any level of pain, cross any hell, just to get his hands around Rome's throat. There was no barrier that could stop him. Not mountains, not swamps, not his own failing body. But a man who can let his own eye rot out of his head for the sake of strategy isn't made overnight. That kind of iron discipline, that obsession with a single goal, is manufactured over years. To understand the monster who emerged from the swamp, we have to leave the mud of Italy behind and go back 20 years into the past. We need to travel to a temple in Carthage, where a father is about to hand his 9-year-old son a knife and a choice that will literally burn the ancient world to ashes. Are you ready to see how monsters are made? To understand the man who could lose an eye without flinching, we have to understand the architect who built him. Hannibal Barca wasn't born a monster. He was carefully, deliberately engineered by a man who understood that revenge is a dish best served cold and served by your children after you're dead. His creator was his father, Hamilcar Barca. And just hearing that family name should make you nervous. Barca means lightning in Punic, and like actual lightning, Hamilcar was brilliant, terrifying, and absolutely destructive to everything he touched. Let's transport ourselves back to Carthage in 241 BC. Imagine a city by the Mediterranean, wealthy beyond measure, with harbors full of trade ships and streets paved with money from commerce. The First Punic War has just ended. To the average Carthaginian citizen going about their business, it was a defeat, painful, expensive, but survivable. To Hamilcar Barca, it was a betrayal so profound it poisoned his soul. Here's what you need to understand about Hamilcar's rage. He had fought the Romans in Sicily for years and remained completely undefeated in actual combat. He was a tactical genius who ran circles around the clumsy Roman legions. He won battle after battle. He made the Romans look like amateurs. Yet, while he was winning on the battlefield, the politicians back home in Carthage surrendered. Think about how that feels. You're undefeated. You're winning. And then your own government signs a humiliating peace treaty behind your back, stripping your nation of its wealth and pride. Rome didn't just win. They bullied Carthage like a playground thug. They seized the islands of Sicily and Sardinia. They demanded crippling war reparations that would take decades to pay off. They essentially put Carthage on its knees. Hamilcar returned home, not as a beaten general, but as a man consumed by a cold, calculating rage that would burn for the rest of his life. He realized something that most of his countrymen refused to see. Rome could not be negotiated with. Rome could not be appeased. Rome was an existential threat, a predator that would eventually devour Carthage alive, unless it was destroyed first. But Hamilcar was a realist. He knew he was too old to finish this war himself. He'd spent his prime years fighting in Sicily. He needed a legacy. He needed a weapon that would outlive him, that would carry his hatred forward into the next generation. He needed to create something that Rome would fear long after he was dead. Enter young Hannibal. The defining moment of Hannibal's entire life happened when he was just 9 years old. It's one of the most famous scenes in all of ancient history. But we usually miss the psychological weight of it because we treat it like a cool story instead of what it really is: child abuse in the service of revenge. Hamilcar was preparing to leave for Spain, or Iberia as it was known then, to rebuild the Carthaginian Empire from scratch and secure the silver mines they desperately needed to pay Rome's extortion fees. The young Hannibal begged his father to take him along. He didn't want to stay in the soft, comfortable luxury of the capital where rich kids played and learned nothing useful. He wanted the camp life. He wanted to be a soldier. Hamilcar agreed to take him, but on one absolutely non-negotiable condition. He led the boy into the temple of Baal Hammon, the chief god of Carthage. Now imagine the atmosphere of this moment. Heavy incense smoke filling your lungs. The flickering orange light of sacrificial fires casting shadows on the walls. The oppressive silence of the priests watching. The smell of burned offerings. In the ancient world, oaths weren't just words you said and then forgot about. They were binding contracts with the divine. Breaking an oath invited cosmic destruction. The gods would punish you. Your family would suffer. Your name would be cursed. This was serious business. Hamilcar made his 9-year-old son, a child who should have been playing with toys, place his small hand on a sacrificial victim. A freshly killed animal, still warm with blood, and swear a solemn vow that would define his entire existence. The exact phrasing varies slightly in the ancient texts depending on which historian you read. But the core sentiment was absolutely clear and unambiguous. I swear that so soon as age will permit, I will use fire and steel to arrest the destiny of Rome. This wasn't just a promise. It was a psychological anchor driven into the mind of a child. From that moment forward, Hannibal's life had exactly one purpose. He wasn't raised as a prince to enjoy wealth and comfort. He was raised as a weapon to be aimed at Rome's heart. Hamilcar took him to Spain immediately, far away from the corrupting influence of the Carthaginian Senate and their politics. For the next decade of his life, Hannibal's classroom was the battlefield. His teachers were professional soldiers. His textbooks were written in blood. This is absolutely crucial to understanding the Carthage versus Rome dynamic and why Hannibal became so dangerous. While Roman aristocrats were learning rhetoric and law in the comfortable forum, while they were debating philosophy and practicing their public speaking, Hannibal was learning how to sleep on hard ground, how to endure genuine hunger, and how to kill another human being efficiently. He ate the exact same food as the common soldiers, no special meals for the commander's son. He dressed like them in simple, practical clothing. He fought beside them in the line. He shared their tents and their hardships. Hamilcar was teaching him a vital lesson that most aristocrats never learn. Loyalty isn't bought with gold or family names. Loyalty is earned through shared suffering. This upbringing created a completely unique psychological profile. Hannibal was a high-born noble from one of Carthage's most powerful families. But he had the instincts and mentality of a grunt soldier. He could discuss philosophy with his Greek tutors one moment, debating Aristotle in perfect Greek, and then turn around and personally sever someone's limb in combat the next moment without hesitation. He learned to read terrain like a map, seeing every hill and valley as a tactical opportunity. He learned to read men like books, understanding who would break under pressure and who would stand firm. Most importantly, he watched his father fight for years. He absorbed every lesson. He studied Hamilcar's tactics, his use of ambushes, his reliance on speed over brute force, that lightning style of warfare that the Barca family was famous for. But Hamilcar ran out of time before he could finish the masterpiece he was creating. In 228 BC, during what should have been a minor skirmish with local Spanish tribes, Hamilcar was cornered. To save his sons, Hannibal and his younger brothers, he drew the enemy away from them and drowned in a river. Hannibal, now 18 years old, watched his father die, watched the man who had shaped his entire existence get swallowed by the current. The architect was gone, but the weapon was finished. The hatred for Rome had been tempered by years of discipline and grief. It had been hardened into something unbreakable. When Hannibal eventually took command of the army at age 26, he wasn't just another general. He was the physical manifestation of his father's ghost. He had the best army in the Mediterranean world, a multicultural force of Libyans, Numidians, and Iberians who were all fanatically loyal to the Barca family specifically, not to the city of Carthage or its politicians. And he had a plan that would make the entire ancient world hold its breath in terror. He wasn't going to wait for Rome to start the Second Punic War when they felt ready. He was going to bring the war directly to them. He was going to do the unthinkable, the impossible, the absolutely insane. He looked north toward the mountains that no army had ever crossed in force. The Alps were calling his name, and Hannibal Barca was ready to answer. But could any army actually survive what he was about to attempt? In late 218 BC, Hannibal Barca did something that every military expert in the ancient world said was completely impossible. He looked at the Alps, the massive, frozen mountain range that served as Italy's natural fortress, and decided to walk over it with an entire army. Not around it, not through the passes that traders used. Over it, to understand just how insane this decision was. You have to realize that in the ancient mind, the Alps weren't just mountains. They were the edge of the known world. A place where the gods lived and where humans went to die. They were the boundary between civilization and chaos. You didn't cross the Alps with an army. You didn't even try. But Hannibal wasn't interested in what was possible. He was interested in what Rome wouldn't expect. The logistics alone were an absolute nightmare that would make modern military planners weep. Hannibal wasn't just hiking with a backpack like some kind of ancient tourist. He was moving an entire city on the march. He had roughly 50,000 infantry, 9,000 cavalry, and 37 war elephants. Let that sink in. 37 elephants. In the mountains. In the snow. Imagine the caloric requirements for a moment. An adult elephant eats about 300 pounds of food every single day. In the barren, snow-covered peaks of the Alps. There's no grass. There's no vegetation. There's nothing. Every single scrap of food had to be carried by pack animals, which also needed to eat, which meant you needed more pack animals, which meant you needed even more food. It's an exponential nightmare. This wasn't a march. It was a desperate race against starvation. And everyone knew it. And the mountains weren't empty. They were inhabited by hostile Gallic tribes who saw this massive army stretched out in a vulnerable column and recognized an opportunity. As the Carthaginian column stretched for miles along narrow, icy ledges where one wrong step meant death, the tribesmen ambushed them from above. They rolled massive boulders down the cliffs. Just imagine standing in a tight formation on a narrow mountain path and suddenly hearing a sound like thunder. You look up and see a boulder the size of a house bouncing down the cliff toward you. There's nowhere to run. You're boxed in by men in front and behind. The boulder hits the column and just obliterates a dozen men instantly, crushing them, sending them screaming over the edge into the abyss below. It was a massacre in slow motion. Hannibal had to fight a vertical war, sending his light infantry to scramble up the treacherous cliffs, to seize the high ground, just to stop the rain of death. Men fought on ice-covered rocks while trying not to fall to their deaths. But the true enemy wasn't the Gallic tribes. It was the cold itself. As they climbed higher into the mountains, the autumn snows began to fall. The path, if you could even call it that, disappeared completely under fresh powder. Men who had grown up in the heat of North Africa and Spain. Men who had never seen snow in their entire lives were now freezing to death inside their own armor. The metal conducted the cold directly to their skin. Their fingers went numb. Their toes turned black with frostbite. Animals slipped on the ice, their legs breaking, taking their handlers with them over the edge into 1,000-foot drops. The psychological toll was immense beyond measure. Every single step was a gamble with death. You didn't know if the snow under your foot was solid ground or empty air. Then they hit the ultimate roadblock that should have ended the entire invasion. A massive landslide had swept away the path on a steep cliffside. There was a drop of 1,000 feet on one side and a sheer rock wall on the other. The army was completely trapped. They couldn't go back. The hostile tribes were behind them, cutting off retreat. And they couldn't go forward. There was literally no path. They were stuck on a freezing ledge, with supplies running out and men dying every hour. This is the moment where most commanders would have surrendered or turned back. This is where the invasion should have ended, in complete disaster. But this is also where Hannibal's genius shifted from purely tactical to engineering. He didn't panic. He didn't rage. He used science. He ordered his men to cut down the few stunted trees in the area and pile the wood around the massive boulders blocking the path. They built huge bonfires against the rocks. They set the wood ablaze and fed the fires for hours. waiting patiently until the rocks were glowing red-hot, radiating heat like forged metal. Then Hannibal ordered his men to pour their rations of sour wine, essentially vinegar, onto the heated stone. It was a primitive but brilliant form of chemical engineering. The thermal shock of the cold liquid hitting the superheated rock caused the stone to crack and shatter and crumble. The expansion rates were different, and the rock just fractured. It actually worked. The soldiers used pickaxes to clear the debris, working in desperate shifts, carving a new path directly into the cliffside. They worked until their hands bled, until they collapsed from exhaustion, because the alternative was freezing to death on that mountain. The descent into Italy was, ironically, even deadlier than the ascent. The southern slopes were steeper and covered in slippery ice hidden beneath innocent-looking fresh snow. Men would step on what looked like solid ground and suddenly slide uncontrollably to their deaths, unable to stop, screaming until they hit the rocks below or disappeared into crevasses. But finally, after 15 days of absolute hell, the army staggered out of the mountains and into the green Po Valley. The survivors looked back at the peaks they'd crossed and couldn't believe they were still alive. But the cost was absolutely staggering and almost unbearable. Hannibal had entered the Alps with nearly 60,000 men. He emerged with barely 26,000. He had lost nearly half his entire army and most of his precious elephants to the cold and the cliffs and the ambushes. He arrived in Italy gaunt, exhausted, half-blind from his eye infection, and vastly outnumbered by the Roman legions waiting for him with fresh troops. But he had achieved the one thing Rome never expected and never prepared for. He was there. He was in Italy. The monster had climbed over the wall. The Roman Senate went into complete panic mode when they received the news. They had assumed the Alps were an impenetrable shield, an impassable barrier that would keep them safe forever. They'd built their entire defensive strategy around this assumption. Now that assumption was shattered, and the nightmare was in their backyard. The crossing of the Alps wasn't just a movement of troops from one place to another. It was a statement of intent. It told Rome that no barrier, whether natural or man-made, could keep Hannibal Barca out. No mountain was too high, no river too wide, no obstacle too deadly. The invasion had officially begun, but surviving the journey was only the beginning. Now Hannibal needed to win, and he was about to teach Rome a lesson in warfare they would never, ever forget. By the spring of 217 BC, Hannibal was deep inside Italy, moving like a cancer through Roman territory. He had survived the Alps and the marshes. But survival wasn't enough for what he had planned. He needed a victory so devastating, so psychologically crushing, that it would shatter Rome's confidence forever. To accomplish that, he didn't look for a battlefield. He looked for a victim. His target was Gaius Flaminius, a Roman consul who was brave, fiercely patriotic, and fatally arrogant, the perfect combination for Hannibal's purposes. Hannibal studied this man like a predator studies prey. He knew Flaminius wasn't the cautious type who would sit behind walls and wait. He was a politician who desperately needed a quick, glorious victory to satisfy the angry voters back in Rome who were demanding action. So Hannibal began a calculated campaign of psychological torture designed specifically to provoke Flaminius into making a fatal mistake. He marched his army directly past Flaminius's camp, burning Roman villages and destroying Roman crops. but always refusing to actually fight when the Romans tried to engage. He was essentially slapping Flaminius in the face repeatedly, daring him to come out and fight like a real man. And Flaminius, his pride wounded and his anger rising, took the bait exactly as Hannibal knew he would. Enraged and humiliated, he ordered his legions to pursue Hannibal immediately, marching fast, abandoning all proper reconnaissance and scouting. He was chasing what he thought was a coward fleeing in terror, but that coward was leading him straight into the most perfect death trap in military history. The location Hannibal chose was Lake Trasimene. Geographically, it was a natural killing ground. A narrow road ran along the northern shore of the lake, squeezed tightly between the water on one side and steep, heavily forested hills on the other. There was no room to maneuver, no space to deploy properly, just a thin corridor of death. On the morning of June 21st, a thick, heavy fog rolled in off the lake like a gift from the gods. It blanketed the entire valley floor, reducing visibility to almost zero. You couldn't see more than a few feet in front of your face, and Hannibal had positioned his entire army, cavalry, infantry, and slingers in the hills above the road, perfectly concealed by the tree line and the fog, waiting in absolute silence. Below them, completely unaware, the Roman army marched in a long, disorganized column. They couldn't see the enemy waiting above them in the hills. They couldn't even see the end of their own line through the fog. They thought Hannibal was days ahead, running away in panic. They had no idea they were walking into a slaughter. Then Hannibal gave the signal. Suddenly, the hills exploded with life and death. Thousands of Carthaginian soldiers charged down the slopes, screaming war cries, crashing into the flank of the completely exposed Roman column. Because of the fog, most Romans didn't even know they were under attack until enemy spears were already buried in their chests. It wasn't a battle. It was an execution. The Romans were completely trapped with nowhere to go. If they turned left to fight, they hit a solid wall of Carthaginian shields and spears. If they turned right to escape, they were driven into the deep, cold waters of Lake Trasimene. Thousands of men, weighed down by heavy armor and weapons, were pushed into the lake and drowned like rats. The water turned so dark red with blood that to this very day, a small stream in the area is named Sanguinetto, the place of blood. The locals still remember. But here's a detail that truly captures the absolute intensity and chaos of this massacre, a detail so rare and shocking that it sounds completely made up. But it's recorded in the historical sources. While this slaughter was taking place, while men were dying by the thousands, a massive earthquake struck the region. It was powerful enough to topple statues in nearby cities, to divert the courses of rivers, and to trigger landslides in the mountains they were fighting on. Yet the Roman historian Livy records something absolutely incredible. Not a single soldier on the battlefield even noticed the earthquake happening. They were so consumed by the adrenaline of survival, so completely locked in the desperate frenzy of killing and trying not to be killed, that the earth literally shook beneath their feet and nobody felt it. That's not just battle. That's total war at its most primal. In less than 3 hours of continuous slaughter, 15,000 Romans were killed. Another 10,000 were captured. Consul Flaminius himself was hunted down and decapitated by a Gallic horseman. His head was mounted on a spear and paraded around the battlefield as a trophy. The entire Roman army in the north had effectively ceased to exist as a fighting force. When the news finally reached Rome, the Senate didn't even try to spin it or soften the blow. A magistrate simply walked out to the weeping crowd gathered in the forum and said with brutal honesty, "We have been defeated in a great battle." That was it. No details, no excuse, just the raw truth. Absolute panic swept through the city like wildfire. The bridges over the Tiber River were destroyed to slow any potential advance. Women prayed desperately in the temples, expecting Hannibal to march through the gates at any moment. Parents hid their children. The wealthy packed their valuables. But Hannibal didn't march on Rome. Not yet. He knew something the panicking Romans didn't. He couldn't take a fortified city of that size without proper siege equipment, which he didn't have. Storming Rome's walls would cost him his entire army. Instead, he turned south, gathering more supplies and reinforcements. He was preparing for something even bigger. He was heading toward a dusty plain called Cannae, where he would create his masterpiece of death. Are you starting to understand why Rome was so terrified? This wasn't just about losing battles. This was about facing an enemy who seemed to read minds, who always knew exactly how to hurt them the most. Trasimene was a tragedy for Rome. But what was coming next would be an apocalypse that would haunt Roman nightmares for generations. August 216 BC. The Apulian Plain, near the town of Cannae. The sun is blazing in a cloudless sky, and a hot wind, called the Vulturnus, is blowing grit and dust directly into the faces of the Roman army. Rome has had absolutely enough of Hannibal's tricks and ambushes. They're done playing games. They've decided to solve the Hannibal problem with overwhelming brute force. They assembled the largest army in Roman history, 8 full legions, plus Italian allies. Nearly 86,000 men. It was a sledgehammer specifically designed to smash Hannibal's army flat and end this war once and for all. Leading them was Consul Terentius Varro, a man who genuinely believed that subtlety and clever tactics were for cowards, and that real men simply charged forward and won through superior numbers. Hannibal, outnumbered nearly 2-1, did something that looked like complete suicide to any observer. He arranged his infantry in a strange, convex crescent formation, bulging outward toward the approaching Romans like a bow drawn back. But here's the genius. He deliberately placed his weakest soldiers, the Gauls and Iberians, in the center of that bulge where they take the first impact. Then he placed his absolutely elite African heavy infantry on the far wings, hidden behind the curve where the Romans wouldn't see them coming. It was a trap made of human flesh, and the Romans walked right into it. When the massive Roman block crashed into the center of the Carthaginian line, the impact was earth-shaking. You could hear the collision from miles away, the sound of thousands of shields hitting shields, the screaming, the breaking. The Gauls in the center held their ground for a moment, fighting desperately. Then they began to retreat, exactly as Hannibal had planned. But they didn't break and run. They slowly walked backward, fighting every single step, staying in formation. The Romans, sensing what looked like victory, surged forward with renewed energy. They pushed deeper and deeper into the Carthaginian line, shouting in triumph, absolutely convinced they were breaking through. Their officers were yelling encouragement. pushing them forward harder. They weren't breaking the line. They were entering it. As the Carthaginian center retreated in its controlled withdrawal, the entire shape of the line transformed. The convex bulge became a concave bowl. The Romans were now funneling themselves deeper and deeper into a kill box, and they had no idea what was about to happen. Suddenly, Hannibal gave the order that would change military history forever. The elite African infantry on the wings swung inward like massive doors slamming shut, hitting the exposed Roman flanks with devastating force. At the exact same moment, the Carthaginian cavalry, having already chased the useless Roman horsemen completely off the battlefield, returned and slammed into the Roman rear with incredible speed. The trap was shut. The perfect double envelopment was complete. The Romans were completely surrounded. But this is where the history books usually stop telling the story, and the real horror begins. We need to talk about what the historians call the compression effect, because this is where tactical genius becomes absolute nightmare. Imagine 80,000 men crammed into a space that keeps getting smaller and smaller with every passing minute, as the Carthaginian ring tightened like a noose. The Romans in the center were pressed together so tightly that they literally couldn't lift their arms to swing their swords. They were packed shoulder to shoulder, chest to back, unable to move or fight or even breathe properly. The dust kicked up by tens of thousands of trampling feet created a choking cloud that blinded everyone. The heat inside that compressed mass of humanity was suffocating. Men in heavy armor, literally cooking in the August sun. Panic set in fast and spread like plague. The men in the center of the formation couldn't see the enemy at all. They could only hear the screams of their comrades dying on the edges. Getting closer and closer. They were being crushed by the weight of their own army. Historical accounts describe something so disturbing it's hard to believe. Soldiers digging holes in the ground with their bare hands and burying their own heads in the dirt just to suffocate themselves quickly and escape the terror of waiting to die. Others were found with their hamstrings deliberately cut. Hannibal's men had developed an efficient system. They would slash the legs of the outer Romans to disable them, move on to kill the next standing man, and come back later to finish off the crippled ones at their leisure. It wasn't a battle anymore. It was industrial-scale butchery. It was systematic murder. For hours and hours, the Carthaginians hacked away at the trapped mass of Romans. They worked in shifts, taking breaks to rest their arms from all the killing. Modern historians estimate that at the height of the slaughter, roughly 600 Roman soldiers were dying every single minute. That's 10 human beings extinguished every single second. 10 lives ended. 10 fathers, sons, brothers gone. Every second. For hours. Let that sink in for a moment. Close your eyes and count to 10. In that time, at Cannae, 10 men died. Now multiply that by every 10 seconds for several hours. The scale of death is almost incomprehensible. By sunset, when the killing finally stopped because the Carthaginians were too exhausted to swing their swords anymore, the field was silent except for the moaning of the dying. Over 50,000 Romans lay dead in a space of just a few square miles. Among them were 80 senators, 20% of the entire Roman Senate wiped out in one afternoon. Consul Paulus was dead. Rome had lost approximately 20% of its entire adult male population in a single day. The blood was so deep in places that the victorious Carthaginians had to scrape the gore off their arms just to be able to hold their looted weapons and valuables. The smell was so overpowering that nobody could eat for days. Hannibal had achieved what military theorists said was impossible. He had annihilated a vastly superior force through pure tactical geometry. The Battle of Cannae is still taught in every single military academy on Earth today as the perfect battle, the gold standard of tactical excellence. But for the men trapped inside that shrinking circle of death, it was the day their world ended in blood and screaming. But here's where the story takes a turn that will blow your mind. What happened next, or rather, what didn't happen next, might have changed all of human history. Let me tell you about the decision that historians still argue about 2,000 years later. The sun set over the field of Cannae, leaving behind a silence heavier than the roar of battle. In the Carthaginian camp, the celebration was wild and chaotic. They had done the impossible. They had erased the Roman army from existence. The road to Rome stood wide open, with no military force capable of stopping them. Victory seemed inevitable. That night inside Hannibal's command tent, his cavalry commander Hannibal slammed his fist on the table, still pumped with adrenaline from the day's slaughter. He looked directly at Hannibal with fire in his eyes and made a proposal that seemed obvious to everyone. Give me the cavalry and let me ride ahead. In 5 days, you shall be dining in the capital of Rome. It was the obvious move that everyone expected. Rome was completely defenseless. Their legions were dead. Their generals were dead. Their senators were dead. The gates stood unguarded. One quick march, and the war would be over. Hannibal could end the Roman Republic right there. But Hannibal sat there in silence, staring at the map spread before him, and slowly shook his head. He refused. He said he needed time to rest his exhausted men, time to gather proper siege equipment, time to consolidate his victory and plan the next move carefully. Hannibal stared at his commander in complete disbelief. The opportunity was perfect. The moment was now, and Hannibal was saying no. In frustration and anger, Hannibal uttered one of the most famous lines in all of military history, words that echo through 2,000 years. Vincere CS. Hannibal, victoria utinescis. You know how to gain a victory. Hannibal, but you do not know how to use one. Was it a catastrophic mistake? Historians have literally debated this decision for 2 millennia. If Hannibal had marched immediately, could he have ended the Roman Republic right then and there? Could he have conquered Rome while they were still reeling from shock? Maybe. Possibly. We'll never know. But Hannibal was a professional soldier, not a reckless gambler. He understood that Rome wasn't just any city. It was a fortress with massive walls and hundreds of thousands of citizens who would fight street by street, house by house. He didn't have siege towers. He didn't have battering rams. He didn't have the equipment necessary to assault a major fortified city. More importantly, Hannibal was betting on something that seemed rational, that Rome would behave like a normal nation. In the ancient world, when you lost your entire army in a single battle, you sued for peace. That was the universal rule. You negotiated terms. You paid tribute. You surrendered. That's what civilized nations did. So instead of marching on Rome, Hannibal sent his brother Mago back to Carthage to deliver the good news and request reinforcements. Mago walked into the Carthaginian Senate, a body that had been deeply skeptical of Hannibal's entire war strategy from the beginning. He didn't make a long speech. He didn't present detailed reports. He simply upturned a massive basket onto the marble floor. Thousands of gold rings spilled out, clattering and bouncing across the stone. In Rome, Only the equestrians, the upper class, the knights, the senators were allowed to wear gold rings as a mark of their status. Mago calmly explained that each ring represented a noble Roman leader personally killed by Hannibal's army at Cannae. The pile was so large it literally had to be measured by the bushel. It was undeniable proof that Rome's entire leadership class had been decapitated. The Carthaginian Senate erupted in celebration. They doubted Hannibal. Now he'd delivered the impossible. But while Carthage cheered and celebrated their victory, Rome did something that defied all logic and all precedent, something that would change the course of history. When the first battered survivors from Cannae stumbled back to the city, panic threatened to tear Roman society apart. The cry "Hannibal at portas, Hannibal is at the gates," echoed through the streets. Women screamed. Men prepared for the end. But then something absolutely terrifying happened. Something that reveals the true nature of Roman power. The Senate met in emergency session, and they didn't discuss surrender. They didn't debate peace terms. Instead, they passed decrees that were completely insane. They outlawed grief. They literally made it illegal for women to cry in public. They limited the official mourning period to just 30 days. They banned the word peace from being spoken in the forum. This wasn't stoicism or bravery. This was a collective psychotic break. They were so traumatized that they decided to simply reject reality itself, desperate to appease the gods who had clearly abandoned them. The civilized Romans turned to dark barbarism. In the Forum Boarium, in the heart of the city, they performed a ritual that shocked even their own people. They buried 2 Gauls and 2 Greeks alive as human sacrifices to wash away the bad omens and curse that had fallen on Rome. Think about that. This was supposedly the most civilized society in the world, and they were literally burying people alive to please angry gods. It showed the absolute depth of their terror. They were willing to do anything, absolutely anything, to survive. And then came the mobilization that proved Rome was not a normal nation. They scraped the absolute bottom of the barrel for soldiers. They lowered the recruitment age to boys who hadn't even reached puberty, children wielding swords. They opened the prisons and armed the criminals, promising them pardons if they fought. Most shockingly of all, they did something that violated every Roman principle. They bought 8,000 slaves from their owners, armed them, and promised them freedom if they survived the war. They called them the Valones. When Hannibal sent an envoy to Rome to discuss ransoming the thousands of prisoners he'd taken at Cannae, a standard, civilized practice where you pay money to get your soldiers back, the Roman Senate refused to even meet with the envoy. They declared that any Roman who allowed himself to be captured instead of fighting to the death was not worth saving. They left their own sons and brothers to rot and die in Hannibal's prisoner camps rather than give him a single coin of gold or show any weakness. This was the moment Hannibal realized he might have made a fundamental miscalculation about his enemy. He had broken Rome's army. He had killed their soldiers. He had massacred their leadership. But he hadn't broken their mind. In fact, he had done the exact opposite. By hitting them so hard, he had stripped away all their civilized pretenses and revealed the monster underneath, a cornered, rabid animal that would fight with insane desperation until the very last drop of blood. The war of tactics and clever maneuvers was over. The war of pure attrition, the grinding war, where victory goes to whoever can outlast the pain, had begun. And Rome, it turned out, could endure more pain than anyone thought possible. The question was, could Hannibal For the next 13 years, a strange and frustrating stalemate descended upon Italy like a fog that wouldn't lift. Hannibal was technically the winner. He marched up and down the boot of Italy, undefeated in every battle, sacking cities and capturing towns. But he was fighting a ghost that refused to die. After the catastrophe at Cannae, Rome finally learned the lesson that had cost them 50,000 lives. Fighting Hannibal in an open, pitched battle was a guaranteed death sentence. So they handed the command of their armies to a man named Quintus Fabius Maximus. And this decision would save the Republic. His nickname was Cunctator, which means the delayer. At the time, Romans absolutely hated him. They called him a coward. They mocked him mercilessly for refusing to draw his sword and fight like a real man. But Fabius was the only Roman general smart enough to truly understand the nature of the Second Punic War. He realized that Hannibal's weakness wasn't his brilliant tactics or his ability to win battles. His weakness was something much more basic: supply lines. Hannibal was operating thousands of miles from home, with no secure base of operations. Every piece of food, every weapon, every arrow had to be found in Italy. So Fabius introduced what we now call the Fabian strategy. And it was warfare as pure psychological torture. It was a war of shadows and patience. Wherever Hannibal marched, Fabius followed at a distance. But he always stayed on the high ground, just out of reach, watching and waiting. If Hannibal moved to a valley to forage for food, Fabius would appear on the hills above, watching but never attacking. If Hannibal tried to bait him into a fight with insults or provocations, Fabius simply stayed put. More brutally, Fabius ordered a scorched earth policy on his own country. He systematically burned Roman crops, destroyed Roman farmhouses, and forcibly evacuated entire Roman villages before Hannibal could reach them. He essentially starved his own people to ensure that Hannibal would have nothing to eat when he arrived. It was cruel. It was deeply unpopular. The people whose farms were being burned by their own army cursed Fabius's name, but it was absolutely, brilliantly effective. Hannibal was now effectively a prisoner of the Italian peninsula. He was like a lion trapped in a cage. He could roar. He could pace back and forth, showing his teeth. But he couldn't escape, and he was slowly starving. His army was changing too, and not for the better. The hardened veterans who had crossed the Alps with him, who had survived the marshes and won at Cannae, were dying off from old age, disease, and attrition. They were being replaced by local Italian mercenaries who didn't share the same fanatical loyalty or iron discipline. The sharp edge of the Carthaginian sword was slowly, inevitably dulling with each passing year. Yet even in this slow-motion suffocation, Hannibal's genius would occasionally flash like lightning, reminding everyone why he was so feared. There's a famous story from the Ager Falernus region that perfectly illustrates his gift for psychological warfare. Fabius had finally managed to trap Hannibal in a valley, carefully blocking all the mountain passes with his troops. It looked like checkmate. The Roman soldiers were celebrating, thinking they'd finally caught the fox. But that night, something terrifying happened. The Roman sentries, stationed on the mountain ridges, saw thousands of torches suddenly appear in the darkness, moving up the mountainside toward their positions. It looked like the entire Carthaginian army was launching a desperate nighttime assault over the peaks. Fabius, cautious as always, moved his troops to intercept what he thought was Hannibal's main force. It was all a trick. Hannibal had gathered 2,000 oxen from the surrounding farmland, tied bundles of dry wood to their horns, lit them on fire, and simply stampeded the terrified, burning animals up the mountain. While the Romans were busy chasing and trying to stop a herd of flaming cows in the darkness, Hannibal quietly marched his real army out through the now unguarded pass below. He had outsmarted them again, using nothing but creativity and an understanding of human psychology. It should have been humiliating for Rome. But these moments of brilliant tactical success were becoming rarer and rarer. They were flashes of genius in an overall strategic situation that was growing grimmer by the month. The brutal truth was that Hannibal received almost no meaningful help from Carthage. The politicians back home were jealous of his success and afraid of his growing power. They refused to send significant reinforcements or supplies. Some historians believe they actually wanted him to fail. He was completely on his own, fighting with a dwindling army against an enemy with infinite resources. And while Hannibal was stuck playing cat and mouse in Italy, achieving nothing strategic, Rome was making brilliant moves elsewhere. They realized something crucial: they couldn't kill the lion. So they needed to attack the lion's den instead. They sent armies to Spain to cut off Hannibal's reinforcements and wealth. They sent armies to Africa to threaten Carthage itself. And rising through the ranks of these expeditionary forces was a young Roman general who had survived Cannae. He had been there, in that circle of death, had seen his friends butchered, had somehow escaped. But unlike other Romans who feared Hannibal, this young man had studied him with cold, obsessive focus. He noted every move, every trick, every tactical formation. He didn't want to avoid Hannibal. He wanted to become Hannibal. He wanted to beat the master at his own game. His name was Publius Cornelius Scipio, and he was about to change everything. While Hannibal was wasting his genius on burning cattle tricks in Italy, the real war that would decide everything was being fought in Spain. And the man Rome sent there was exactly 25 years old, technically too young to legally command an army under Roman law. But Publius Cornelius Scipio was the only man willing to take the job after his father and uncle had both been killed fighting Hannibal's brothers. Scipio was different from every Roman general who had come before. He didn't fight like a traditional Roman. He fought like Hannibal. He understood that war wasn't about following gentlemanly rules or maintaining honor. War was about exploiting every weakness, breaking every expectation, and doing whatever it took to win. Investidavet, B.C. Scipio set his sights on New Carthage, the capital of the Carthaginian Empire in Spain. It was a fortress city surrounded by water on 3 sides and considered absolutely impregnable by conventional assault. The walls were thick and high. The garrison was strong. Attacking it directly would cost thousands of lives. But Scipio had done his homework in a way that would have made Hannibal proud. He spent time talking to local fishermen, gathering intelligence that no general had bothered to collect. He learned that the lagoon on the northern side of the city drained dramatically at low tide, dropping several feet and becoming wadeable, just like Hannibal had used the Alps and the marshes as weapons. Scipio used the ocean itself. He waited for low tide, and in a move that looked like divine intervention to his superstitious soldiers, he marched them straight through the shallow water, where the city walls were lowest and most poorly defended, because the Carthaginians had assumed the water made that approach impossible. They stormed the city in one afternoon. Scipio captured Carthage's treasury, its best weapon, smiths and artisans. And, most importantly, the hostages that Carthage had been using to keep Spanish tribes loyal. He didn't just win a battle. He stole Hannibal's entire wallet and political support structure in one brilliant stroke. With Spain lost, Hannibal's situation in Italy became truly critical. He was running out of men, running out of supplies, and running out of options. His last desperate hope was his brother Hannibal Barca, who still commanded armies in Spain. Hasdrubal performed what should have been impossible, a miracle that deserves more recognition in history books. He raised a brand new army in Spain and actually crossed the Alps, following the same deadly path his brother had taken years before. He was bringing fresh elephants, fresh gold, and 30,000 experienced soldiers to join Hannibal in Italy. If the two brothers managed to link up their forces, Rome would be doomed. The combined Barca armies would be unstoppable. But Rome had learned the value of intelligence and speed from their painful lessons. The Roman consul Marcus Livius Nero, not the famous emperor. This is a different Nero, intercepted Hasdrubal's messengers, who were carrying letters to Hannibal. He learned the entire plan, including where and when the brothers intended to meet, in an incredibly daring forced march that pushed his men to the breaking point. Nero took 7,000 elite troops and marched north in complete secrecy. He moved so fast that Hannibal had no idea the southern Roman army had disappeared. Nero joined forces with the northern Roman army, and together they vastly outnumbered Hasdrubal at the Battle of the Metaurus River. They annihilated Hasdrubal's army in a brutal fight. Hasdrubal himself died fighting. Refusing to surrender or flee, Hannibal knew none of this. He was waiting in southern Italy, every day scanning the horizon for his brother's banners, expecting reinforcements that would change everything. One morning, a Roman cavalry patrol rode up to Hannibal's outpost. The soldiers didn't attack. They didn't shout challenges. They simply threw a large sack over the camp's ramparts and rode away in silence. When Hannibal's guards opened the sack with curiosity, they found something that made them scream. Inside was the severed head of Hasdrubal Barca, preserved well enough that the features were still recognizable. The Romans hadn't just killed him. They had kept the head fresh, specifically so Hannibal would recognize his own brother's face. It was a message of pure, calculated psychological brutality. It said, "We can kill anyone you love, and we will make sure you see it." Hannibal looked at the dead face of his brother, the last family member fighting beside him, his last hope for victory, and reportedly said, with quiet defeat, "I see there the fate of Carthage." In that moment, he knew with absolute certainty that it was over. The reinforcements were dead. The supply lines were permanently cut. Scipio had conquered Spain. There was no path to victory anymore. Scipio was now preparing to invade Africa itself, to attack Carthage directly. The Roman Senate recalled him from Spain to plan the ultimate invasion. And Carthage, finally realizing the existential danger they faced, sent Hannibal the order he had dreaded for years: come home. He had to abandon Italy after 15 years of fighting. He had to leave behind the veterans who had followed him through hell. He had to kill his own horses because he couldn't transport them across the sea. He had to sail back to defend a city that had never properly supported him, that had left him to fight alone for more than a decade. The stage was set for the final confrontation. Two masters of war, one aging legend fighting for his homeland. One rising prodigy, fighting for revenge and glory, were about to meet on the sands of North Africa in a battle that would decide the fate of the ancient Mediterranean world. Everything had led to this moment. After 16 years of blood, it would all come down to one afternoon, October 19, 220 B, the plains of Zama, south of Carthage. The air is thick with dust and the smell of impending violence. After 16 years of continuous bloodshed, the Second Punic War has come down to a single afternoon. Two armies face each other. Everything will be decided today. But before the swords were drawn and the killing began, something extraordinary happened, a moment so cinematic that it feels like fiction. Yet it's recorded in multiple ancient sources. Hannibal and Scipio rode out to meet each other alone in the empty space between the two armies. Just the two men with their interpreters. No guards. No weapons drawn. Just talking. Imagine the tension of that scene. On one side, Hannibal, now nearly 50 years old. A living legend. One-eyed and weathered by years of war. The man who had haunted Rome's nightmares for nearly 2 decades. On the other side, Scipio, just 33 years old. Beautiful and confident. Undefeated in battle. The Roman who had learned to think like Hannibal. The student facing the master. Hannibal spoke first. He offered peace terms. He actually sounded tired as he warned Scipio about the fickleness of fortune, telling him that victory today could easily turn into disaster tomorrow. He spoke about the uncertainty of war, about how luck can change in an instant. He was essentially asking Scipio to be merciful, to end this without more death. Scipio listened respectfully to every word. Then he looked Hannibal directly in the eye and refused with brutal simplicity. He said, "You started this war when you attacked Saguntum. Now you must finish it." There was nothing left to say. They rode back to their respective armies. The talking was over. Only violence remained. Hannibal played his final card with everything he had, left 80 war elephants. This was the largest elephant corps he had ever assembled in one place. His plan was brutally simple. Charge the massive beasts straight into the Roman center. Crush their formation with pure shock and terror. Then let the infantry mop up the survivors. It was the same tactic that had terrified Roman armies for years. But Scipio had been waiting his entire military career for this exact moment. He had seen what elephants could do. He had studied every account of how Hannibal used them, and he had developed a solution based on physics rather than brute force. He organized his legions not in the traditional tight checkerboard pattern that Romans always used, but in columns with wide open lanes running straight through the entire army from front to back. He cleverly hid these lanes with light skirmishers spread across the front, so the Carthaginian elephant drivers couldn't see the gaps. When Hannibal gave the signal, the ground shook with the thunder of 80 elephants charging. As they approached the Roman lines, Scipio's soldiers blew thousands of trumpets simultaneously. The noise was absolutely deafening. An overwhelming wall of sound designed specifically to panic the animals. Some elephants panicked immediately, turning back in terror and trampling Hannibal's own cavalry on the wings. The ones that kept charging forward hit what they expected to be a solid wall of Roman shields, but instead found empty space. The Roman soldiers simply stepped aside into the prearranged lanes. The elephants, following the path of least resistance, like water flowing downhill, ran harmlessly down the corridors Scipio had created. As they passed through, Roman soldiers on both sides threw spears into their soft flanks. The supposedly unstoppable force had been neutralized by empty space and clever thinking. With the elephants gone and his cavalry routed, Hannibal was forced into a grinding infantry battle, exactly what he didn't want. His veterans from the Italian campaign fought with the desperate courage of men who knew there was no retreat, no escape, no second chance. They were actually pushing the Romans back for a while. For a brief moment, it looked like Hannibal might pull off one last impossible miracle. But then, the ghost of Cannae returned to haunt him. The Roman cavalry, having chased the Carthaginian horsemen completely off the battlefield, wheeled around and returned to slam into the rear of Hannibal's army with devastating force. It was poetic justice of the cruelest kind. Scipio had used Hannibal's own signature move, the double envelopment, the encirclement, against the master himself. The student had learned the lesson perfectly and used it to destroy his teacher. 20,000 Carthaginians died on that field. Hannibal, seeing the complete collapse of his army, personally fled the battlefield, not out of cowardice, but to return to Carthage and urge the Senate to surrender before the city itself was destroyed. He told them the brutal truth, with no sugarcoating. I have not just lost a battle. I have lost the war. Carthage surrendered within days. The peace terms were utterly humiliating and designed to ensure Carthage could never threaten Rome again. They had to burn their entire fleet, 500 ships set ablaze in the harbor. A bonfire visible for miles that symbolized the death of Carthaginian power. They had to pay a massive indemnity that would take 50 years to complete. And most crushing of all, they could not wage any war without explicit Roman permission. Carthage ceased to be a superpower in a single afternoon. They became a client state, a puppet dancing on Roman strings. The nightmare that had terrorized Rome for 16 years was finally over. Rome had won. But for Hannibal, the end of the war was not the end of his story. In fact, survival would prove to be a punishment far worse than death. What happens to a legend when the fighting stops? You're about to find out. And it's heartbreaking. You would think the story ends at Zama. The villain loses. The hero wins. Credits roll. Everyone goes home. But history is never that clean or simple. Hannibal didn't die at Zama like a warrior should. He went back to Carthage and did something that shocked everyone who knew him. He took a desk job. He was elected as a suffet, essentially a chief magistrate, a civilian administrator. And just like on the battlefield, he turned out to be an absolute genius at it. He dove into the boring work of government with the same intensity he'd brought to military campaigns. He rooted out corruption that had been festering for decades. He reformed the entire tax system to make it fair and efficient. He rebuilt Carthage's economy so effectively that within just a few years, the city offered to pay off their entire massive war debt to Rome in a single lump sum payment. This terrified Rome more than any army ever had. The Roman hardliners in the Senate realized something chilling. Hannibal Barca didn't need elephants or armies to be dangerous. As long as he was alive and thinking, he was a threat. A prosperous Carthage under Hannibal's leadership might rebuild its military, might seek revenge. The nightmare might start all over again. So the Roman hardliners, led by Cato, the elder, who famously ended every speech with Carthage, must be destroyed, demanded Hannibal's immediate arrest on trumped-up charges of conspiracy. They wanted him in chains or dead. Hannibal knew they were coming. He'd lived too long as a hunted man not to recognize the signs. So one night, he fled into the darkness, beginning a tragic wandering exile that would last for nearly 20 years of constant running. He went from kingdom to kingdom in the east, Syria, Crete, Armenia, Bithynia, offering his services as a military advisor to any king who would dare fight Rome. He became a ghost, haunting the edges of maps. A living legend reduced to begging for employment. He was the old lion, toothless but still roaring, trying desperately to ignite one last fire that might burn down the Roman Republic. But the world had moved on without him. The kings he served didn't really listen to his advice. They hired him for the prestige of having Hannibal Barca as their general, but then ignored everything he said because they were arrogant or stupid or both. He won them some minor victories, but nothing that mattered. Nothing that changed the trajectory of Roman expansion. The Romans never stopped hunting him. They sent agents to track his movements. They pressured his employers to betray him. They wanted him to know he would never be safe, never be free, never escape. Finally, in Stosum Desiatri BC, the net closed completely. Hannibal was living in Bithynia, in what is now Turkey, serving King Prusias. The Romans pressured Prusias to give up his famous guest. Soldiers surrounded Hannibal's house in the middle of the night. Hannibal, always prepared, checked the secret escape routes he'd built into every residence he'd lived in for 20 years. Every exit was blocked. They'd found them all. He was trapped. He didn't panic. He didn't beg. He had been carrying his final escape plan with him for years, always knowing this day would come. He wore a ring with a secret compartment containing a lethal dose of poison, probably extracted from a plant, carefully preserved. Waiting for this exact moment, he looked at the poison and spoke his final words, recorded by Roman historians with a sense of bitter irony. Let us relieve the Romans from the anxiety they have so long experienced, since they think it tries their patience too much to wait for an old man's death. One last insult, one last bit of defiance. Then he drank the poison and died alone in a foreign land. Far from home. He was 64 years old. So who actually won the Second Punic War on a map? Rome won decisively. They eventually razed Carthage to the ground in 146 BC during the Third Punic War, destroying it so completely that they allegedly salted the earth so nothing would ever grow there again. They became the undisputed masters of the Mediterranean, the superpower of the ancient world, but in a deeper, more fundamental way. Hannibal won. He didn't conquer Rome, but he fundamentally changed its DNA forever. Before Hannibal, Rome was just a regional power with a citizen militia that fought local wars. To defeat Hannibal, Rome had to transform itself into a permanent military machine. They had to normalize the idea of a standing professional army. They had to accept generals with absolute power like Scipio, which set the precedent for future warlords like Sulla, Pompey, and eventually Julius Caesar, who would destroy the Republic from within. The fear of another Hannibal created the Roman Empire. It made Rome ruthless, paranoid, and aggressively expansionist. They conquered the entire known world not because they wanted to, but because they were terrified that if they stopped, another monster would come over the Alps. Every Roman child grew up hearing nightmare stories about Hannibal. Every Roman general was judged against the standard he set. Hannibal Barca didn't destroy Rome with his armies. He forced Rome to destroy its own republic to survive him. He broke their minds. And in doing so, he shaped the history of Western civilization forever. The Roman Empire that ruled for centuries, all the aqueducts and roads and laws and literature, exists in part because one man from Carthage scared them so badly they had to become monsters themselves to survive. That's a legacy more powerful than any military victory. That's immortality. If you've made it this far in this epic story, thank you for joining me on Maproom Battles. Make sure you're subscribed, because we dig deep into these forgotten corners of history, where the truth is always more incredible than fiction. Drop a comment and tell me, do you think Hannibal was a hero fighting for his homeland? Or a villain who sacrificed his people for a personal vendetta? I genuinely want to know what you think. Until next time, remember that history isn't just about dates and battles. It's about understanding what humans are truly capable of when everything is on the line.